information in my practice with my patients has been transformational, totally changed how I approach helping people with their mental health issues and their gut issues. So just a little background about me. I'm a UC Davis grad, went to medical school at UC Davis, was faculty at UC Davis, and I'm an Institute of Functional Medicine certified physician. And I want to start with a little bit of my story, why I'm here and how I got to this point, because I didn't begin with this way. I'm so fortunate now to get to work with people in this wonderful root cause resolution medicine, where I really get to dig into what's going on that's triggering these chronic symptoms so that I can really help people heal. And it's not about using Band-Aids, which unfortunately medications often really are Band-Aids. They have a place. I'm going to be I'm the first to acknowledge that. However, they don't, again, address the underlying cause, and they often come with side effects, and they often don't work. And when you know you have something that you really want to get to the bottom of and solve, medications are very limited. So I'm very conventionally trained initially. I went to UC Davis, as I mentioned, for medical school and had a wonderful education there in what we call allopathic medicine. And I began my training in psychiatry, and I loved that. I loved psychiatry because it combined some of the art still of medicine as well as the science. The role of therapy was important to me, recognizing the connection between the doctor and the patient, and childhood events and life experiences and how that interacts with our health. However, in the end, I was very limited in what I was able to do for people. It was mostly prescribing medications. And I ran up against the limits of those again and again. But I was very fortunate to come across the literature on nutrition and lifestyle and how that can impact health through my sister's health journey, actually. And it was actually very upsetting when I first saw this information, because it made so much sense and it was so impactful. And I didn't understand why I hadn't learned any of this in medical school. It was actually, it really made me mad, because I naively thought I had learned pretty much everything I was going to need to know. And that, of course, was not the case. And there's a whole wealth of wonderful research out there on how what we eat, how toxins, all number of things, how that impacts our health. And there's so much that we can do to change that. And we are fundamentally meant to be healthy. And that was something I didn't really used to know. I mean, I think I was in the sort of raised, as you could say, in medicine with this concept of illness is like a battle, a war we have to wage, and it's sort of inevitable. And you better hope your genetics don't doom you to something terrible. And my perspective has totally changed. From studying the anthropological research, looking at hunter-gatherer tribes, they don't have the chronic diseases that we have. And it's really helped me open my eyes and realize that we fundamentally are meant to be healthy. And if we give our bodies what it's looking for and get out of our body's way, we can have tremendous health and tremendous healing. And so much is possible. So it really changed my whole world view. And I realized I had to change my practice. I wanted my patients and I wanted my community to know this information so that they could actually enjoy the real benefits of true healing. So it led me to found my practice, Catalyst Health Center for Functional Medicine, and to continue my journey in studying and I just continue to learn all the time, because I love that and I love bringing that information to my patients. So I'm so fortunate now I get to work in this more broad way. I mean, I sometimes still do need to use medications, and it's important that I understand them because I can help people when it's appropriate to come off of them. But my toolbox is so much bigger, and it makes for such a more satisfying connection with my patients and satisfying outcomes. So I'm excited to share this information with you, because there's so much you can do beginning now to influence the health of your brain and the health of your gut by understanding this connection. So Hippocrates, I feel like, said it so well all those years ago: the natural healing force within each of us is the greatest force in getting well. And that's what we're trying to harness here with this information. So first, I want to explain what functional medicine is and why it's such an important approach. It is based on systems rather than thinking in terms of the brain separate from the gut, separate from the cardiovascular system. It's systems that are like communication and energy production. And it's a personalized approach, taking individual history into account individual exposures, and individual genetics. It focuses on finding the root causes of the symptoms and healing imbalances that we find. It harnesses the body's natural healing process, and the way we do that best is actually by utilizing nutrition and lifestyle interventions. So some of the key concepts that I really want you to take home today is the concept that chronic symptoms have multiple causes. We are stuck in a mindset in conventional medicine of what is the cause of XYZ disease? Like, what is the cause of Alzheimer's? What is the cause of autism? And we're not going to ever find the cause, because there are multiple factors that add up to those chronic conditions. And they're not the same combination of factors in each person. There's common themes, of course, but this is very important to understand that it's this addition of several factors, and they're not the same for each person. The common pattern is things leading to inflammation. So that is key in functional medicine. The role of the microbiome, which we're going to be focusing on tonight. Genetics and how they're different for each person and how that influences our health. The role of cellular energy production. This is really key. And the role of detoxification, which our body has to do every single day to eliminate things that we ingest normally, and unfortunately all the extra toxins now that we're exposed to. And then the role of the environment is important, and that doesn't just mean the air we breathe and the water we drink, but it also means our exposure to light. When are we looking at light, and when are we not? And when are we what are our relationships like? Do we have fun? Things like that. And other keys are that we spend a great deal of time together when I work with patients, because it takes time to get that history and to uncover what is going on, and to really listen, because often patients hold the key to what's going on, even if they don't realize it. And we create, therefore, a personalized treatment plan with this information. We utilize some tools that I'm going to show you, the functional medicine timeline and the functional medicine matrix. And there's a very important role for testing to get to the bottom of things. We say test, don't guess. And this concept of modifiable lifestyle factors that is foundational. And I'll show you more on that in a minute. So this is an example of the functional medicine timeline. It's just a form that allows us to map what was the stage that was set when you were born. That's the antecedents. That is what were your parents dealing with? Did they have any medical conditions? What were the exposures maybe that they had that would influence you? Triggering events, like did you have a serious infection, or were you exposed to lead, for example, or what were the things that might have been linked to symptoms? And then mediators, like were you eating the standard American diet for years? We'll talk more about that tonight too. But we map on here the symptoms and then these events, and we start to see a pattern. And it can really help us go way back in time and see where the roots of the chronic symptoms began. This is an example of a computer-generated timeline based on symptoms that were inputted. And I just want to show you this because you can see there's clusters of symptoms here. And that's a real trigger when I'm looking at a timeline. And I say, well, what happened then that all of these things started? Sometimes it's like, oh, that's when my baby was born, or that's when we moved into that moldy house. So that's one of the tools we use that's very helpful. And then here's an example of the functional medicine matrix. And these are the systems I was referring to here, kind of circling around this core of mental, emotional, and spiritual. That's the foundation. And this is just a different way of thinking that really changes the approach to medicine and helps with seeing the connections. And at the bottom, the foundation is the modifiable lifestyle factors like sleep, exercise, nutrition, stress management, and relationships. So these are the tools that a functional medicine practitioner uses and that I use every day with my patients. There's that highlighting of the modifiable lifestyle factors. So one of the things I love about functional medicine is well summed up by Albert Einstein's quote. It's a wonderful thing to recognize the unity of complex phenomena that to direct observation appear to be quite separate things. And that's what we're going to see tonight, how the brain and the gut, which you're not used to thinking about as being connected, are actually in a very complex two-way relationship. And another great quote from Hippocrates, all disease begins in the gut. I don't think that's 100% true, but I think it's almost true. Okay, so we're going to start with some basics so you can understand what I'm going to be talking about. I like to start with this slide. And the reason is people don't realize that their intestinal tract, the inside of that is sort of like the outside of you. It's this hole in the donut. It is exposed to the outside environment because of the food passing through and anything we may breathe in particles that get caught in the mucus in our nose, and then we swallow that. That's a normal process. We ingest toxins. All kinds of things are entering the intestinal tract. So it's good to think about it as really it's still an interface with the outside world. And therefore, it has a very difficult job. It's got to let in food and nutrients, but keep out anything that's unsafe. And here's a map of the gastrointestinal tract. And I always like to tell people the story that when I was looking for a picture of the GI tract, most of them were just cut off at the head, like at the neck. They only showed from the neck down. And that, I think, is very symbolic of how we tend to think about the intestinal tract and forget that, digestion and absorption and stuff begins in the head, actually. It begins with noticing our food, smelling it, beginning to salivate, preparing our body for digestion, and with chewing, something that people forget to do. In our society, we tend to wolf our food down while we're standing or driving or doing anything else, talking, and not taking the time to begin digestion properly. So digestion really begins in the head with our brain, and then with our mouth, and smelling with our nose. And the food then, when it's chewed and mixed with the first digestive enzyme that's in the saliva that breaks down starch, enters the stomach. The stomach mashes it all together, mixes it with very strong acid, which is very important because when it's passed on to the small intestine, that acid signals the release of digestive enzymes from the pancreas. And without that, you're not going to break down your food, you're not going to absorb it. And the food should be absorbed in this very long, skinny, small intestine. And then what's left over and not digested, so fibers primarily, enter the large intestine where our microbiome lives, which we're going to talk about, and they break that down. So that small intestine is lined with all these ridges. It's very wrinkly, and every one of those ridges is covered with these little tiny fingers. It's sort of like shag carpet. And that's to make it have as large as possible as a surface area. And the surface area is thought to be over 400 square feet. So imagine all of that inside your body. And that's to allow you enough surface area to absorb all that nutrition that you need for your cells to run every minute. And so the components of the small intestine, it's not just the lining of the intestine, that's the epithelial cells, but it's the muscle that helps squeeze the food down the tube and send it along, the neurons that control those muscles, and a whole lot of immune cells. And I mentioned the surface area already is so big. And the goal in that small intestine is to absorb the nutrients. And the immune system in the gastrointestinal tract has to recognize bugs that are not good for us, those are pathogens, and respond to it with an immune response. And the GI tract houses most of the human microbiome, which I'll explain. 99% of that microbiome is in your large intestine. So this term, gut microbiome, has been in the news a lot in recent years. And you can see, you could Google gut microbiome and any chronic illness, and you're going to find an article on it because it's connected now to everything. It's been connected to all manner of chronic illnesses, including autoimmune disease, skin disorders. There's a whole gut-skin axis. And axis just means connection and communication. It's connected to hormonal issues, including infertility, PMS symptoms, and to psychiatric disorders, which we'll talk more about tonight, and neurological diseases also, like Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. And I should include in there Alzheimer's. So what is the microbiome that I've been referring to? Well, it's over 100 trillion microbes. That's way more cells than we even have cells in our human body. It's found everywhere on us and in us, on our skin, in our noses and mouth, sinuses. It's all throughout, but as I mentioned, most of it is in the large intestine, the bulk of it. And it's made up of bacteria and archaea, which are similar to bacteria, and yeast and viruses. And in the past, especially, also included worms. So gut microbiome total weighs about 2 to 3 pounds, if you can imagine. And I think it's helpful to think of it as another organ in the body. And we need to think about taking care of it, which you're going to come out of this talk, I think, with a good idea of what that is. And here's the thing, it's not the same in each person. There are tons and tons of different species in every single one of us, and nobody has the same pattern. There are key species that are important for immune regulation and health. We're going to get into that, but we don't all have the same pattern at all. And there is not one particular healthy microbiome. There are definitely microbiomes that are unhealthy, but there is not just one single version of a healthy biome. So in the Human Genome Project, they thought they were going to figure out all kinds of things about disease that would explain so much. And they were surprised to learn that we only have 23,000 genes. And part of how can we be such complex beings with so few genes, which is not that different than a banana, for example, is that we have so many bacteria with so many genes. We've essentially outsourced a whole number of jobs to bacteria. We really have co-evolved with them. They are very, very important and play a ton of important roles. So that is why we don't have the same complexity that you would expect, the complexity you would expect given what kind of beings we are. How do we get our microbiome? It begins at birth. When we pass through the birth canal, we get our mother's microbiome. So if a mother's microbiome is really imbalanced, we're going to begin with an imbalanced microbiome. And then we get more aspects of our microbiome through breastfeeding, because breastfeeding actually contains a type of bacteria called Bifidobacteria infantis, which is very important for a healthy gut. And then, of course, over time with exposures, that microbiome keeps expanding and it doesn't stabilize until we're about 2 years old. So modern factors can really impact the microbiome we receive. I already mentioned your mom's microbiome may be imbalanced, and right from there we can end up with a imbalanced microbiome. But C-section birth, though it may absolutely save lives, has unintended consequences of changing the microbiome that the baby receives. And this has been documented in a lot of research. Basically, the baby becomes colonized with bacteria from the skin of the hospital staff, even with their sterile technique, with their gloves and everything. And that's a totally different type of bacteria, or different types. And then also if a mom needs to have antibiotics during labor, which she might for something called group B strep, or premature rupture of membranes, that's also going to impact the bacteria passed to the baby, because a lot of bacteria will be killed. And again, these may be very important procedures, but they have these unforeseen consequences that are going to impact the biome. Other things will also change it. So premature birth can change it. And this is so interesting. The mom's flora meaning the bacteria, change in the weeks leading to preceding birth. It's like it wants to deliver a certain kind of microbiome to the baby. And so when a baby's born premature, the biome is different. And then formula feeding is another thing that has a lot of unintended consequences. I already mentioned breastfeeding is important for a type of bacteria called Bifidobacteria infantis. But it's not just that, it's also the components of the milk, because breast milk is very, very different than formula. And those different nutrients and components promote the growth of different bacteria. And then there's also this concept of the old friends hypothesis, or the hygiene hypothesis. So let me first say that hygiene has been critical for saving numerous lives. We used to have all kinds of problems with unsafe water, and many, many people died in the past from those. However, again, unforeseen consequence to hygiene is we've changed the sort of the exposure we get as kids to germs, some of which were good for us. And these germs would have impacted our immune system and would have sort of educated our immune system. And this is one of the theories about allergy, that allergy can be a result, or like asthma, for example, a result of not having the historical burden of like helminths, I mentioned, worms, things like that, that normally we would have sort of been always sort of fighting off to a certain degree in the past. And now we don't have that. And that part of our immune system that would have handled that now is sort of left without as much to handle and can overreact. That's a hypothesis. So more microbiome disruption occurs when we use antibiotics. Again, sometimes we absolutely need antibiotics, but we often still overtreat. We treat viral ear infections with antibiotics, and that has unfortunate consequences. And then we feed our babies these processed foods that historically we did not eat. And this is going to change the microbiome as well. I mean, the microbiome responds to what it gets to eat. And so rice cereal, for example, feeds different bacteria than perhaps the first foods of our ancestors. And then we progress to the standard American diet. And this is full of all kinds of things that promote certain kinds of bacteria growth and do not promote the growth of beneficial bacteria. You know, in this picture, there's barely a vegetable, right? There's like the lettuce and the tomato, and that's about it. And, you know, vegetable fibers are very, very important for growing beneficial bacteria. And then sugars and processed flours and damaged, refined fats that aren't healthy that we see in like fried foods from restaurants, those really have a huge impact on the microbiome. And even the artificial sugars, they have a very big impact as well. There was a whole effort to, you know, there was a thinking that if we used artificial sugars instead of sugars, we could really improve the rate of people getting diabetes. But unfortunately, the opposite has been true, because these sugars that we can't absorb, the bacteria can digest, and that changes the microbiome, and they can influence obesity and diabetes. So they're not good for us either. So what does a microbiome do? Well, when we're kids, it educates the immune system. It's teaching the immune system, hey, this is a friendly bacteria, don't fight it off. We don't want to be fighting off every bacteria in our gut. We need them. We want to be fighting the right ones. And the microbiome modifies intestinal permeability. So what does that mean? That's the lining of the gut and how close together those cells are and how much it's letting things through, how permeable it is. It makes for a healthy amount of permeability when there's a healthy microbiome. The bacteria produce all types of neurochemicals, neuropeptides, neurotransmitters. I give the example here of GABA, which is a calming neurotransmitter. So beneficial bacteria can produce that and help with calming and relaxation. The microbiome directly influences inflammation. That's that interaction with the immune system. And an imbalance in microbiome can trigger inflammation both locally in the gut, but also throughout the whole body. And the microbiome helps to recycle the bile acids that we use in digestion. So again, maintaining nutrients, not just like losing those out of our body all the time. It helps break down more nutrients from the fiber and helps us then absorb those. These are amino acids, vitamins, and essential fatty acids. Oops, sorry, there. It also, critically, they produce short chain fatty acids, which are needed for fuel for the cells lining our colon. So there's a very symbiotic relationship there. The bacteria are producing fatty acids that the cells actually need for fuel. So we need those bacteria there to support the health of the cells. They provide antioxidants by breaking down these plant compounds. And I mentioned how GABA can calm the nervous system. And the microbiome produces this great thing called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That is like growth factor for your brain. That helps keep your neurons healthy. That's something that we need as part of prevention of Alzheimer's, for example. So when we've got quote unquote bad bacteria, and I put it in quotes because many bacteria aren't necessarily bad, but they become a problem when they're overgrown. So when they're present in too high a quantity, they can produce harmful compounds that damage our cellular energy capacity, the mitochondria in our cells. And all kinds of diseases are associated with problems with the mitochondria, which I list here, like autism, Alzheimer's, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and many more we keep realizing are connected to this. The bacteria produce chemical messengers that are important for helping us fall asleep. And insomnia is linked to imbalances in gut bacteria or dysbiosis. I want to tell you quickly a story of a patient I met who, when we were doing her history, she said, you know, I used to have really bad insomnia, but, you know, I was found to have these pockets in my gums, and the dentist worked on those and we resolved that. And then I didn't have any trouble sleeping anymore. Isn't that weird? I said, no, it's actually not, because this is the connection. So dysbiosis, as I mentioned, is an imbalance And that can be, a lot of different things can mean dysbiosis in the gut. You can have an overgrowth of normal bacteria, but they can be in the wrong place. They can be in your small intestine. Remember, the small intestine is where you absorb your food, and the bacteria are supposed to be in the large intestine. You can have a lack of good bacteria all by itself. That's a deficiency dysbiosis, and that alone can cause major problems. You can have not enough good bacteria and too many of these quote unquote bad bacteria, or you can actually have pathogens, bacteria that are bad in any amount, or an overgrowth of yeast. And you can have a lack of diversity. One of the keys to a healthy microbiome is having a huge variety of different species. So another way you can have dysbiosis is to have an infection with a parasite. When I was in medical school, I learned when taking a patient's history to ask, have you traveled to anywhere recently, any foreign destinations? And if they hadn't traveled, then we didn't worry about parasites. Turns out that's really not adequate. You can pick up parasites right here at home. And this can happen when your immune system is impacted, is not working as well, when you don't have enough stomach acid. I see a lot of these infections all the time. I see Blastocystis hominis, this protozoa. I see this a lot. And I see other protozoal species too. And every once in a while, I will actually see worms on someone's stool test. So these are a problem because they impact how well the gut functions. They impact how well the gut moves food along. If we're not moving the food down to the large intestine ultimately, then we can get overgrowth of bacteria up in the small intestine. And that's one of those cases of dysbiosis that I mentioned. And that can cause a whole lot of symptoms. So this concept of intestinal permeability, I want to come back to that. Here you can see pictures of the cells lining the gut, and you see how they're packed closely together like bricks in a wall. And they're tied together with these things called tied together with things called tight junctions. And here they're showing healthy tight junctions. And those little fingers sticking off of each cell, those are called microvilli, and that's just for more absorption, more surface area. So when there's a problem with the intestinal permeability and it's increased, that's when we call it leaky gut. And you can see why. The cells now are not tightly held together. The tight junctions are open and damaged. And here you also see damaged microvilli. Well, the things inside the gut, they're in that purple area. That would be food particles, undigested proteins, components of bacteria, toxins. They all can now pass between the cells and enter our bloodstream. And when they do that, they trigger our immune system, because the immune system says, you're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be in the gut. So what causes this? Well, the imbalance in bacteria or yeast in the gut, that alone can impact it. I said earlier that the microbiome modulates that intestinal permeability. So there's a really tight relationship between the health of the cell linings, the intestinal lining and the cells there, and what is present in the gut in the form of bacteria. Not having enough beneficial bacteria causes this, having an infection with a parasite, also a number of things we might consume, like ibuprofen or other non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. The birth control pill can do this via its hormonal effects. High blood sugar can do this. And that's what so many people have going on and they don't even realize it. They may have a pre-diabetes. That's going to be impacting the gut health. And our standard American diet, that inflammatory diet, the inflammatory sugars and fats can trigger leaky gut. And then here's a big one, stress. Stress of all sorts can trigger leaky gut. And when I say stress, I want to expand your concept of what the definition of stress is. So just to take a second on that, we're all used to thinking of stress as emotional or psychological, which it is, but it can also be physical stress on the body, illness, infection, overexercise, injuries, toxin exposure. Those are all stressors as well. Lack of sleep is an enormous stressor. Lack of community and lack of touch, which right now are really big, right? We're not in contact with each other right now, and that's hard, and that's a source of stress. And these will impact our gut permeability. So managing stress, reducing stress where we can, that makes a huge difference. When we have that stress occurring, it actually impairs our immune function, and particularly the immune function in the gut. Something called secretory IgA, which is like a first line defense of the immune system in the gut, that gets reduced. When we're stressed out, we're in what's called the parasympathetic state, the sympathetic state, or fight or flight, which I'll explain more of. But that decreases the blood flow to the intestines. We can't digest when we're running from a tiger. Unfortunately, we're not usually actually running from a tiger, but our brain sort of thinks so when we're in that state from stress. Stress actually changes the mix of bacteria in the gut, and that never ceases to amaze me that it can have that impact. So when we have leaky gut, why is that a problem? Well, I mentioned how proteins, toxins, components of bacteria, they cross into the bloodstream. There's this particularly inflammatory component of bacteria called lipopolysaccharide that is extremely inflammatory. And it's kind of an ancient thing. And so our body has long been programmed to know that it's inflammatory. And it needs to stay in the gut and not be in the bloodstream. That inflammation, that triggering of the immune system, causes a whole cascade of steps which lead to systemic inflammation. So not just in the gut. And when that systemic inflammation is triggered, that's occurring in the brain as well. The immune cells in the brain are actually turned on, and that has consequences for our brain health. We form antibodies to things like LPS and the large undigested proteins, like maybe dairy proteins or gluten, for example. And those antibodies then don't just attack those targets they were designed for, but they cross-react with some of our own tissue. They can, depending on our genetics. Maybe it's the thyroid, maybe it's the lining of the gut itself, maybe it's your joints. This is how autoimmune disease occurs. So without leaky gut, autoimmune disease is thought to not be able to occur. It's one of the key components. You have to have a genetic susceptibility to the autoimmune disease and have a trigger like the bacteria or the toxin, but you have to have the leaky gut too. And by healing the gut, you can reduce the immune response, the inflammation, and really improve autoimmune symptoms. So how do you know if you have leaky gut? Well, there's all kinds of symptoms that can be a sign of that. Skin rashes, headache, joint pain, bloating and gas, of course, diarrhea, constipation too. Food sensitivities are a big sign, especially if you keep getting more and more food sensitivities. That's a sign of ongoing leaky gut. Brain fog, that's huge. I see a lot of that in my practice, as well as depression and anxiety. And I'm really on a mission right now to get people to understand that anxiety has all these other roots, because of course, with the coronavirus and everything going on, there's plenty of cause for anxiety, but not everyone's experiencing that equally. And part of that reason is we have a different susceptibility or different vulnerability. And it's because of all these underlying factors that we can actually do a lot about. So chronic inflammation of any kind of chronic symptom usually indicates there is a problem with leaky gut. So the gut has been termed the second brain, and that's because of all the neurons in the gut. It's a huge amount. You may have heard of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Well, 90% of the serotonin is actually in our gut, only 10% in our brain. And these bacteria are having all kinds of impact in terms of neurotransmitters and immune modulators that affect our brain. So the gut really is the second brain. So the gut-brain axis, that's that connection that we're focusing on. It's a two-way communication, and there's several ways that the gut and the brain communicate, and they keep finding out more. So first of all, I've already mentioned the bloodstream, right? Different chemicals, neurotransmitters are absorbed into the bloodstream from the gut and travel to the brain and interact with the immune system. But there's also the lymphatic system. That's the system that takes out the trash, so to speak. Molecules are absorbed there as well and travel. And then this is fascinating to me, the vagus nerve. This is the longest nerve in the body, and it comes from the brain stem, the base of our brain. And it travels to our lungs, our heart, and our gut, and is in charge of digestion and gut motility. And of course, the brain interacts with the gut that way. But here's what's so amazing. Chemicals will actually travel from the gut, from the bacteria, up the vagus nerve back to the brain. That just amazes me. And so there's so many ways that the gut and brain are in communication. And I just covered that, so I'll go to the next slide. That's all about the vagus nerve. And there's some interesting studies. Well, there's really a lot of studies along these lines, but here's an example. Mice that don't have a normal microbiome have these different behaviors. They show risk-taking behaviors, higher cortisol, the stress hormone, and lower brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that growth hormone for the brain. And when you give the bacteria from a healthy mouse with normal microbiome to these mice that were lacking the microbiome, their behavior changes. And they become, they don't take the same kind of risks and they don't have the same kind of stress. And vice versa, if you change the timid mouse's bacteria to the bacteria of the risk-taking mouse, the behaviors change. There's all kinds of studies like this, including ones with obese mice and skinny mice, and they change the microbiome and the skinny mouse gains weight and the obese mouse loses weight. And this has been shown to some degree in humans as well. So I mentioned the fight or flight state, that, when we're under a lot of stress, we feel this, we feel our rapid heart rate. This is the sympathetic nervous system, it's called, and it's there to save our lives. It's there to help us flee from predators, to protect ourselves. And that's a good thing in the moment. And to do that, it lowers the blood flow to the gut, because we're not worried about digestion right then. We're worried about having our muscles have enough blood and our brain be able to work really well. However, you can imagine if you're stressed all the time, then this has a lot of consequences. Our gut is not working well. Digestion is not happening with chronic stress. Now, the opposite state is the parasympathetic state, or the rest and digest state. And rest and digest says it all. And that's responsible for digestion, for slowing our heart rate. And when we do slow, deep breathing, we actually turn that on. We're turning on that vagus nerve, turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. And we're actually moving into a state that will allow for digestion. So you can see there's a lot we can do to promote digestion. When we have that fight or flight state going on, we don't produce stomach acid, which you remember from the beginning is critical for triggering the release of digestive enzymes from the pancreas. And then our gallbladder won't release bile correctly. The blood flow to the intestines is lowered and they're not working right. And we don't have the motility to move the bacteria and the food along and keep the bacteria in the large intestine. In between meals, if we wait long enough in between meals and overnight, there's this wonderful cleansing wave called the migrating motor complex that squeezes out, it wrings out our small intestine like a tube and shoves everything down into the large intestine. That's not going to happen if we have problems with gut motility, and the fight or flight state can prevent that. So we end up with bloating, we end up with pain and discomfort, heartburn. We don't absorb our nutrients, which leads to a host of issues. And we end up with bacterial and yeast overgrowth and leaky gut. So you can see how it's sort of like a snowball effect. So there's a lot of links with the microbiome and mental illness. There's many studies showing that anxiety and depression are both associated with inflammation. In fact, when people respond to an antidepressant, where their depression gets better because of taking an SSRI medication like Prozac or Lexapro, their markers of inflammation are reduced. So it's somehow working by actually reducing inflammation. It's not really just all about the serotonin levels. We see that in anxiety and depression, there's low brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And remember, the beneficial bacteria make that. We see high stress hormone levels and an overactive stress response, which puts us more into that fight or flight state and further worsens the gut health and further worsens the anxiety and depression. We see, of course, leaky gut too. So you're seeing how it's all connected, and it can become a really vicious cycle. So mood disorders like depression are linked to microbiome, and this example of lack of breastfeeding as an infant is associated with higher rate of depression. That doesn't mean you're going to get it, but there's a risk factor there. And that's because of that key beginning microbiome, that those bifidobacteria that aren't getting put into the gut of the baby. And that has a huge impact on the microbiome overall as we grow. And the bifidobacterium probiotic has even been demonstrated in one study, in a small study, to be as effective as citalopram, which is Celexa. So, there is a role there for getting the healthy bacteria on board to help us feel better. There's a study that is interesting from 2013 in UCLA that showed that using a probiotic yogurt helped people have decreased emotional reactivity. So not being so triggered. They did this by putting people in an MRI machine and showing them different images of like angry faces, and then you would have an emotional reaction, and that reactivity calmed down just from a probiotic yogurt. We see that mice fed probiotic bacteria have less stress and decrease depression and anxiety symptoms. And that human studies with probiotics can show improvement in focus on positive information. So that's something that happens with depression, right? That everything looks worse and it sort of skews the lens that we're looking at things through. And so these probiotics change that. And we see that they experience less anxiety when stressed and lower stress hormone. And again, that fundamental bacteria that we get at birth helps calm the stress response. So there's a lot of interesting links with the microbiome and autism. We know it's associated with problems in the gut, problems with imbalances in bacteria and in detoxification. And when there's constipation, then detoxification is even made worse because nothing is coming out that the body's trying to excrete. And we see a lack of those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. Here's two names of them, butyrate and propionate, which are produced by the beneficial bacteria. And there was a great trial in Arizona. When I first began giving this talk, they had just started that research, but now it's been published. And it showed the effect of a fecal transplant. So that's actually putting different bacteria in a patient in autism, and huge improvement in autism symptoms. So the only change was changing the gut bacteria. So you can see how hugely impactful that can be. There are studies in ADHD showing that there's a link with breastfeeding having reduced risk of ADHD. This is history of C-section, ear infections, and antibiotics, all things that impact what microbiome we get, right? That are increased with a higher risk of, associated with a higher risk of ADHD. Constipation is more often seen, even fecal incontinence. It's not to say that most kids with ADHD have that, but just that there's a much higher rate of it in ADHD than in kids without it. ADHD patients also are low in that neurotransmitter GABA that's so calming to the brain, and that's made by beneficial bacteria. And there was even a study that's been out now for a number of years showing, comparing a probiotic to Ritalin, and they also use nutritional supplements and omega-3 fats. Those are essential fatty acids there, and they were equally effective. So I've told you all these things about how the microbiome impacts the brain and the complicated and intimate connection they have. What can we do about this? How can we promote a healthy microbiome? Obviously, we may have things in our past. Maybe we were born via C-section. Maybe we were formula fed. We can't do anything about that. But I think it's still helpful to understand how that may have contributed to the microbiome we have, and knowing what we can do then to promote shifting it, because we still can shift our microbiome. The number one thing that changes it is what we're eating. And then stress. Stress is so big. And I really want to make sure you understand that it actually affects that bacteria and the health of the gut. So getting enough sleep is one of the number one ways to manage stress and has a big impact on the health of the gut. We want to think about feeding our microbiome. This comes back to what I said earlier about we want to think of it like another organ. You want to take care of it. So you're feeding yourself. You're looking at the food and saying, does this have the nutrition I need and not have things in it that are going to harm me? But does it also have what the bacteria need? Is there a lot of vegetable fiber and a colorful array of vegetables that contain lots of different chemicals that will feed the bacteria, beneficial chemicals? Do I have healthy fats here that the microbiome need? Avoiding overuse of antibiotics. So of course there are times when we need antibiotics, but if we do have to have them, trying to take some precautions to maintain our microbiome. And minimizing toxins, so eating organic when we can, being aware of what chemicals we're using to clean our homes, or what products we're putting on our body with makeup and lotions and shampoos. These all matter. So number one factor, again, is what we eat. Real whole food, that is the key. That's what we evolved eating. That's what our body expects. That's what our microbiome expects. And that produces the growth in the right bacteria. So what do we want to do? We want to avoid processed foods, packaged foods with a huge list of ingredients, right? And these carbohydrates that are so refined that they're not in their original states and the cells are broken up, that can be more inflammatory. Sugar is a huge culprit, really minimizing sugar and the artificial sweeteners as well, and food additives, because the bacteria are impacted by those. And we want to avoid antibiotics in meat because that hurts our bacteria. We want to eat as clean of protein sources as we can. So think in terms of eating whole foods. Think about vegetables. So we want a wide array of vegetables because those fibers are fermented or broken down by the bacteria. They eat that. And they want all those different phytonutrients, they're called, or the polyphenols in our colorful vegetables. We say eat the rainbow. You want to be eating a wide variety of colors. And you can get that from all kinds of vegetables and berries and some other fruit. But those nutrients really grow the beneficial bacteria. So Eli Metchnikoff got the Nobel Prize eventually for his work on understanding the role of probiotics. He did this study on, he made these observations that these people in the Caucasus in Europe were having these seemed longer lived and very healthy. And he connected it to the kefir that they drank, which is a fermented like yogurt type drink. And he did all this research on the bacteria. And so his work was kind of the very first understanding of the concept of probiotic and that it could influence health. And I like to encourage people to eat real food probiotics, fermented foods. There is a role absolutely for targeted probiotic supplements, but as a regular way of just maintaining the health of your gut biome, you can eat probiotic food. Now, most cultures historically have had some kind of probiotic food, whether it's kimchi or sauerkraut or some kind of little condiment, and they're usually not eaten in mass quantities. There's some small amount, but it's at most meals. And they're kind of just constantly giving their bacteria, their gut, a little bit of these bacteria that travel through and send beneficial signals and are helpful to the health of the gut lining. And these were just some that I pulled out of my fridge and took a picture of. There are so many options available now. It's really cool to see. It's really changed in the last, even 5 years about what's available. You can get fermented ketchup and salsa, all kinds of things. It's important that you buy these from the refrigerator section. So sauerkraut that's in a can doesn't have anything living in it. That won't be helpful. Same with dill pickles that are just on the regular shelf. But if they're refrigerated, they have live cultures. That's what you want to have. Here's a list of some options. I didn't mention already, kombucha is another option. There are, if you're going to go for yogurt, you really got to be careful. You're buying, whole milk yogurt and no sugar added. That a lot of those other yogurts are just really not good for you with all the sugar. But whole milk yogurt, if you tolerate dairy well, can be a great source of probiotic. And here's some pictures of pickles, and that's kefir grains on the top. That's that culture right there that is they put into the next batch to grow the kefir or to transform the milk into kefir. And then that's kimchi on the bottom. That's cabbage. So one word that I want to make sure you got about probiotics is they don't actually take up residence. You're not actually like seeding a garden. They're not going to grow there in your bacteria, but they are like a placeholder. And they can be helpful when you're on antibiotics to have probiotics there to kind of help prevent an overgrowth. And they are interacting with your immune system as they pass through. So they're still extremely helpful. I just think that most people think, oh, I'm taking these and then they're going to grow in my gut. And that's not what actually happens. And the most common beneficial probiotics out there are ones that contain various species of lactobacilli and bifidobacterium, some of the key species that we get early on. So what else can you do besides what I've listed about controlling stress and eating whole foods and avoiding damaging foods? Well, if that's not enough to help you feel better, there may be something deeper going on. And sometimes that's because there's a parasite or there's toxins or there's a real imbalance in how you can absorb nutrients that needs to be addressed. And working with a functional medicine practitioner can make a humongous difference there. I see it happen all the time. And you can do some additional steps to support gut healing right now. There are supplements. The co-op has a whole host of wonderful supplements that support gut healing. And you can talk to their staff about it. They will be able to give you good suggestions. And bone broth can be a very helpful, supportive food to be drinking. You can make it yourself, or now you can even buy good bone broth. And that contains glycine, which is very helpful for the gut lining. So those are some nice steps you can take to support gut healing. So I want to tell you about a story about a patient of mine, just in closing here, so you can understand what's possible when you address the gut-brain axis and heal that. This is a story of Linda, who was one of my patients in my program. She came to me with a lot of anxiety. She had panic attacks and baseline anxiety as well. And she was on a medication for that already, and it had helped a little bit, but not enough. She was still having the panic attacks. And she had irritable bowel syndrome. And because of that, she had diarrhea, and she never knew when she had to run to the bathroom. She had to plan her life around knowing that there would be a bathroom nearby. She was someone who used to love traveling, but flying was now out of the question because of the worries about the bathroom, and also about the panic attacks. So her whole quality of life was really, really impacted. And it just seemed like it was getting worse every year. So when we worked together, went over her history in detail, I could see some real key things from her timeline that had influenced her digestion. For her, a big one was that she'd had her gallbladder removed, and that happened a few years before her anxiety started, and which made perfect sense to me. And on testing, we found that she had yeast overgrowth, and she had multiple nutritional deficiencies. So we created a personalized treatment plan for her that addressed these factors. And stress was part of the story too. And she worked hard to learn stress management techniques. And within a few months, she had no more IBS. Her anxiety and her panic had totally resolved. And then she was actually able to come off of her anxiety antidepressant medication, her SSRI. And now she travels. She's enjoying life to the fullest. She got her life back. And it's all because we healed that gut-brain connection. So I want to close with another quote from Hippocrates, my favorite guy. Just to remember this, please: let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. I think he was quite wise. So here's my contact information if you are interested in more information. And I want to, I'm going to put in the share here, the chat, let me find it. I'm going to put let me see if it'll paste. Yes, this is a link where you can go right now if you would like to receive some notes that are like the key points of this talk. We prepared a wonderful handout. It's just 5 pages, really simple to read, and I encourage you to download it. You go ahead and sign up there, and you can ask to be on my email list. And also, if you're interested in finding out what it would be like to work together, there's a place to check a box there too if you would like. So I encourage you at least to get that handout, because I think you'll want to reference some of this information, because it was a lot of information, and you'll want to return to it and start taking action on some of those steps I discussed, because there is so much you can do to feel better. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. And the first thing I'm noticing here in the chat is a comment that there are so many types of diets, acid alkaline diet, the mitochondrial diet, and do I recommend one more than another? And also, is this being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. And so Julia from the co-op, who's on with us today, will be able to send that out after this. Probably tomorrow I'll get that to her. So yes, you can rewatch it and share it if you'd like. Okay, it's in someone's asking, they don't see the download link. It's in the chat. Let me see let me know if you still don't see it. I'll try to figure out another way. Not here in the chat. Oh, I know what I did to all panelists. Let me see. Sometimes Zoom. Okay, there we go. I think now you'll be able to see it. I just only sent it to the panelists and not the attendees, sorry. Okay, great. Thank you for pointing that out. Definitely want you to have access to that. So to get back to the question, there's so many types of diets. Is there one kind of diet I recommend? Well, if you notice, most of those diets actually have about 90% of their information in common. Everybody's recommending real food, right? And avoiding food additives and avoiding sugar. And starting there will get you a long ways. Now, there are, of course, subtleties and there are differences. And I do really recommend very personalized nutritional differences based on testing when I work with patients. You know, someone who has problems with blood sugar may need a different amount of carbohydrates, or someone with food intolerances may need to avoid certain foods until the gut is healed, or maybe longer term, depending on what it is. So there are all kinds of differences I might recommend to someone, but I would say general rule of thumb, lots of vegetables, colorful array of vegetables. If you have a hard time digesting vegetables, that's a sign that there are issues. There could be that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so work needs to be done to heal that, because you should be able to tolerate healthy foods. And if you're not, something is not going well. Okay, I'm going to check the Q&A now. If I can. I'm actually going to, let me actually just go back to just that. We don't need the slideshow anymore. And let me see. Question. I see some hands up too. Okay, that's awesome. I will get to you. So, how do I diagnose leaky gut? Liberty asks. Hi, Liberty. Good to see you here. Liberty's an old friend of mine. So, leaky gut, you can diagnose it with a test. You can use something called a lactulose mannitol test. You can use there's different tests you can use. I actually don't usually do that, because anybody who has chronic symptoms has leaky gut. It's always there. And when I do a stool test with a patient, we always find the bacterial imbalances. And if there's an imbalance, there's leaky gut. So we basically operate on that assumption. It's a pretty safe bet. And it's, you know, we want to focus our resources on other tests. Julia asks, can I talk a little about the role of prebiotics? Yes, that's so great. So that's that vegetable fiber I'm talking about. And also beans, for example, can have lots of fiber. Our diet in general now is much lower in fiber than our ancestors. People get something like average of like 11 or 13 grams of fiber. And historically, we got 30 grams or more. And that fiber is what the bacteria eat. So prebiotics are anything bacteria consume that help them grow. And so some probiotic supplements will contain some prebiotics. Some of those things might, like an example is inulin. There's a whole bunch of different types. They can be great to help support the growth of beneficial bacteria. However, you may have reactions to them. And again, if there's maybe small bacterial overgrowth, a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you could get a lot of bloating from those. I would say with prebiotics, you want to incorporate them slowly. Same with probiotics, really, because you're shifting what's going on in the gut. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. And, you know, I would say again, if you want to ask about prebiotics in particular, like which ones to get, I really refer you to the Sacramento Food Co-op. They have really great staff that can answer the questions in their health and wellness section. Okay, another question is, what about carbs, as in rice and sweet potatoes, or is some okay or not at all? So that's a great question. How much carbohydrate you take, you can tolerate really depends on your blood sugar balance. And that's something I test patients for. But it's something you can experiment with yourself too. If you find you're eating a higher carb meal and then you're getting really sleepy, that's too many carbohydrates for you. You want to balance that out with protein and fiber and fat at each meal. Whole food sources like sweet potatoes, I would say, are optimal. Some people can tolerate rice pretty well. It depends. And sometimes it's just really about how much you're eating at each meal. But yeah, that's an individual thing that takes some experimentation. Okay, I want to answer a few of these questions from people who have their hands raised. So I'm going to call on Randy and see if you can talk now. Can you, are you there, Randy?
Yes, I am. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can, yeah. Go ahead and ask your question.
Actually, I was just trying to get the link, and you put that in the chat, so that was all I needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put it in there again. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Did you see it in the chat?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. Good. All right. Thanks. And I see Janice has her hand up, and Janice, you also put a question in. So I'm just going to ask you if you have an additional question, because I saw you had written a question.
No, it's just more, you know, what's your typical like breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I mean, just quickly.
Well, I'm a big fan of eating a lower carbohydrate breakfast myself. I feel better when I do that. Like eggs, I eat pastured eggs, which are chickens that are from chickens that are eating bugs and weeds. Those eggs are really, really full of nutrition. And as long as you tolerate eggs, they are a common allergen. But for people who don't, they can be really, really healthy food. And I just make sure I'm having good fats. I use grass-fed butter. I tolerate dairy protein okay, so I can do that. And then I focus on vegetables and clean proteins. I eat lower carb in general, and then I might have more carbohydrates at dinner time. And I might use potatoes or sometimes rice. It depends. But always the goal is to increase the vegetables. And that's something I'm always working on too.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. Anybody else have a question? I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm trying to figure out Zoom still. There we go. Okay, I see another question. What do I think about GABA and dopamine cycle? I was thinking about tyrosine and glutamine during the day. Okay, well, I think that's actually pretty complex. So I don't want to get too into that. I think that, yeah, neurotransmitter stuff is pretty complicated. There's a lot of things that impact it. And, you know, the focus tonight is on kind of how the gut microbiome impacts it. So you want to make sure you're increasing the beneficial bacteria to increase that GABA. And of course, dopamine can get out of balance when we're overeating things like sugar, which really hits that dopamine reward circuit. So that's kind of what I would say right now. I mean, and then production of neurotransmitters depends very much on the absorption of amino acids. So if we're not breaking down proteins well, because we don't have enough stomach acid, then we're not going to get the raw materials we need to produce the neurotransmitters. Any other questions today? Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for attending and for all those great questions. I hope it was helpful. I really encourage you to download the PDF, the guide, so that you can get the key points from tonight's webinar. And hopefully you'll pick something that you can take action on right now. You know, one word of caution, don't try to overwhelm yourself by doing everything. That is not how we make progress, really, but take one step. Maybe it's getting more sleep even. That has a huge impact on the microbiome. Or maybe you're gonna add in a couple extra vegetables each day. But focus on that until it becomes an easy habit, and then work on incorporating the next step. But do things one at a time so that those habits stick. Thank you all so much for being here, and I appreciate your attention. Have a great evening.